You're listening to the Choose Your Chaos podcast with myself, Nathan Hayes. On this show, we look to explore and simplify the practices coming to the fore in mental health, health and fitness, spirituality, productivity, and body optimization. Together with experts, leaders, and explorers, this show is about understanding how different practices connect and harmonize, how you can adopt them, and perhaps where all of this is going as a collective and as individuals. Today's podcast is with Stef, or who is more commonly known by his YouTube pseudonym Uberboyo. If any of you are familiar with Nietzsche, you might recognize that tinge, that inspiration from Nietzsche's Übermensch, and this is very much the perspective that Stef comes from. Stef is very much a man of the 21st century. Between his YouTube channel, his storytelling courses and groups, his social media and business mentorship, and being a creative director on a number of projects, Stef has consciously made himself a man of the digital age and has even used AI art to construct short films animating Nietzsche's concepts for this generation. With such a vast and creative drive behind him, I'm really looking forward to digging into exactly what it is he's listening to and what he's listening out for as he blazes into the new age. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Uberboyo onto the show. Hello, Stefan.
How are you doing, sir? What is going on?
I'm not doing too bad. I am so eager for this one. I've watched your stuff for a while and I'm very excited about this because you are, for me in my head, you are like a symbol of like vitality. Like there's just this constant energy of just like, let's go. And I'd love to know, how do you balance between, because you're very creative, as in like you're one of few people who is creative and driven, as in like it's a very beautiful mix you kind of have in between there. And how I conceptualize this is the judge and the artist. The artist is the expansion and the judge is the kind of focus. And I'd love to know, because this show is all about practices, how you stretch yourself in those two directions, because they are opposites. And I'd love to know, just straight out the gate, exactly what is your relationship with them? How did you develop it? And what practices do you have now that stretch you in those two directions?
So I think when I'm speaking to people about creativity, I always like the caveat with it that it's a mental modeling thing first, an awful lot of the time in my head. You are quite naturally creative. A lot of people say stuff like, I'm a creative, or some people are creative, some people are not creative. I think that's kind of bunkus in a way. Because if you think about it, first of all, and this may be too crude for the show, apologies, but if you make love to a girl and you happen to, I don't know, go all the way and, you know, have your way and hit orgasm and all this type of stuff, you are going to share your genes with her and you're going to create a baby. It's going to happen. You are naturally designed to be fertile and be creative. And this is a sort of factor of life. Likewise, when you go to sleep every single night, you generate dreams. You dream every single night. It is constant stream of images. You have 7 dreams on average a night. Now, you could argue that each of those dreams is a creative act. And so when it comes to you working during the day or producing stuff during the day, I don't think it's as much of an act of will as people might think. Like, you dream 7 times a night, you probably have 7 big ideas a day, or at least like one big story a day. And in some sense, it's an awful lot about you just learning to get out of the way and let that part of yourself channel out there. Most highly prolific creators I see just have a very deep understanding of this type of stuff. They know what part of them is the generative creative part, and they build a lifestyle around getting out of the way and just letting that part of themselves come out. So, for example, like The Weeknd, volumes of music that he produces, because he just knows that I can sing well, I'm good at finding harmonies, and he makes space for that in his life. So I think that first principle is extremely important to understand, because an awful lot of people intellectualize creativity and they make mistakes about understanding what a creative person is. And Jung even spoke about this, that he would often meet people who would have this narrative of the tragic, struggling artist genius who's trying to create the perfect work and is like wrestling with this. And Jung said that almost all of those, in fact, maybe all of them, were not very creative or intelligent or genius. Maybe intelligence rough, but they weren't very creative or genius people. They actually weren't Richard Wagner or Mozart or Beethoven. None of them were like that. And actually, these were people who had a neurosis going on that was getting in the way of them living their lives. Whereas he noticed that the artists that he would meet that are actually good and consistently producing stuff and genuinely talented more often than not, were quite healthy people. They were quite well constituted. They had a well constituted attitude towards the creativity. And every time they fell into an era of like disease or distraction, their creativity would actually fall, and it would get in the way of something they could naturally do. And some of the best artists he saw were just constantly producing works. They were always doing it. They're very, very prolific. So he was sort of he pushes back, and like one of these memes, the creativity is some like thunderstorm that happens every now and again, and instead it's something that you're gifted with. Nietzsche is another great example of this. Like Nietzsche struggled with his health. So if I'm my dreams and my fertility and my creativity is coming out of me, if I'm fundamentally unhealthy, then that creativity is not really going to come out of me as strong. That's always going to be a struggle for me. And so Nietzsche, for a very long period of his life, is very sick, but he solved that. He figured out how to become healthy towards the kind of 1870s. And that set him up for this period of his life where he was super creative. And he produced like volumes, basically almost like a book a year during his peak decade. And that kind of goes to show us that, like, if you figure out how to just get out of your way, the volume of work, of high quality work you can produce is extraordinary. You know, you can really, really do a great job. So that mental model I find very important. And that leads then to questions about practices, because practices become elegantly simple then at that point. Like if you understand that you have this imagination, you like me and you work in the groups together and stuff like that. So I talk about the flash. The flash is actually in some sense supposed to teach you about that creative fountain inside of your head that's naturally there. So if you connect with that and understand that that is just every single day flashing ideas all the time, you can't stop it. It's impossible to get that to turn off without making yourself sick. If you understand that that's there, then you realize that you just have to build a practice that's able to channel that. So for example, with me, I realized that telling stories on YouTube is a great way for me to channel that stuff. I'd love to make movies. I'd love to make music and stuff like that, but the kind of destiny didn't really fall into my hands in this way. The era I live in is more the era of social media and the internet. So I put it in that direction, and I put my stories out there, and it sparks people's imagination, which achieves the artistic goal, which is what I'm going for. And that allows me to construct a very elegant and simple practice. I basically have to get up, make sure I'm healthy, get some sun, go out for a walk, maybe do something in the gym, or maybe rest, or maybe eat like a nice breakfast, and then sit down and tell a story or two. Figure out a story I can tell and put it on social media in some sense. Figure out a way to do that. And I keep it very, very simple. You know, I try to say to myself, as long as I'm making a story, that creative spark will be funneled into this, and it will be expressed and projected. And then boom, I will go to sleep that night being like, well, you did something there today, my man. And over the long run, that really just starts to stack up. That becomes incredibly prolific, because every single day you're having a whack at a big story. And then over the course of a year, you produce like 50 to 100 stories, and people look at you and say like, wow, there's just like, you just never stop type thing. And it's like, man, I've loads of bad days. I've loads of days where I write 10 sentences and I'm like, I can't do this. I'm fucked. I'm sick, something like this. That happens all the time. You know, today I'm a little bit tired. I was a little bit late starting and all this type of stuff. So I didn't get a huge amount done, but I got something done. I did a little bit of writing, got kind of these rocked and roll in order. And I've stuff that I want to plan to do, for example, when we're finished talking and whatnot. And this is the thing, is that like you can get it done if you make the space and understand what you're trying to channel. I don't think it needs to be too complicated, and I'm very much against people overcomplicating it. Now, that's the kind of the contextual picture. Now, if you want to talk about specific practices, we can definitely get into that. But of course, these only are relevant once you get the larger context in place. There you go. Oh, that's a good answer.
Not only was that a great answer, but it just gave the best example of how I tried to define you at the start, where it's just so creative and high energy at the same time. It doesn't you're very upfront with this, which is beautiful. I'm trying to channel this in myself. I'm trying to stand upon virtues, and I'm finding a few practices and stuff like that. But I would love to dig into that. But I will ask first, you mentioned creating a space. Once you create a space for it, and you've said that YouTube is kind of a funnel for you. That is kind of how you bring the judge in. That is where rubber meets the road and all the rest. And that's what holds you accountable and then kind of forces you to produce or stuff like that. So I'd love to know then how you create a space that is able to withstand that judgment and that force and allows that creative explorer mode to kind of flourish.
That's a really good question. That's a good question. I use a slightly different mental model. Like I know you're using the category, the judge and the explorer, perhaps. I would often say the editor and the child is the way I see it inside of my head. So the child is inherently messy. The child is happy to go play with his Lego and smash everything. The editor is much more mature and adult, and he's much more severe. But of course, the editor sharpens everything and makes everything like presentable, this type of thing. And the child is creative. The editor is sterile. The child is sloppy. The editor is sharp. So they are opposites. And they're like different modes of thinking. I've also thought about this in context of left hemisphere, right hemisphere, but I'm not sure if that's the correct way to model it either. Nonetheless, these are there's definitely something to this. So when I go to make something, for example, I was preparing a piece of writing yesterday, and I was talking about like the 19th century and workers in that. And I was going and I wrote that I did my first draft of that on Monday. And so first of all, like Monday, what happened? I was doing my Mike Menser high intensity training. I went down to the gym, did my legs, stumbled back to my house, and then sat down. And it's quite straightforward. I try to just get the blank page as soon as possible. A problem I sometimes have is I get distracted. I go on Twitter, I go and check comments, I go and check emails. That's one issue. Sometimes that breaks me out of that. I try to put that at the end of the day, these type of things. But nonetheless, my first goal is to try get to the blank page as soon as possible. I keep it effortlessly simple. Get to either recording into the camera or the blank page, one of those two. Right now, I'm actually thinking about making it just recording into the camera. It might be handier to do it this way. Regardless, I go and I get to that blank canvas, whatever it is, either the camera or actual canvas, as soon as possible. And I try to start, I'm very good now at just switching on the flash, the imagination. I can very, very quickly sit down, think about what I'm trying to say, and then boom, I'm in the image world. And at that point, I just try to get those images out into the page. Now, I say we probably will end up talking about this. When I'm allowing my imagination to turn on, I was talking about the 19th century, for example. I'm seeing this like amorphous sort of set of visions show up. So I'm seeing a worker in his hobbled up Oliver Twist clothes walking through a giant smog covered London with like the factory setting in the background, the giant big 19th century machines churning. I'm looking at like I can see now the image of a young English girl in the farmland looking at the city rise in the horizon and darken the sky and stuff like this. Like I'll see all this stuff as I'm trying to talk about this topic. And the first draft is me being quite childlike, trying to grab those images and shove them down. I'll start to write. I'll start to get these images out. What I'll write probably won't have an awful lot of sense. It won't be perfect, but it will get like this sort of muscular thrust of the vital core imagistic ideas that are very emotionally stimulating. I'll get the strong images. Then sometimes I'll just post that. Like sometimes it'll have enough stream of consciousness force that I can just rip it out on Twitter or like rant about it and throw it up on YouTube. Sometimes it just works, but other times it won't. And so what I'll do is I'll leave it a day and then come back to it the next day and go and do it again. But like I'll have a much different attitude this time. I'll probably maybe listen to it again a little bit, or I'll have an idea in my head about what I'm trying to say. And this time the more critical side of me is there. So say, for example, the first day I was thinking about these amorphous images of the 19th century and they came out in some type of weird narrative that didn't quite make sense. The second day, I'll have this like harsher, clearer categorizing mind, the mature editors in place. And I'll say, I want to tell a story that starts at point A. It's almost like mathematical, of the girl in the countryside, and it moves through the steps towards reaching London City. And I want to go through these sequences in order to tell this. And then that precision will be there, and I'll chop up some of the language and I'll edit little pieces and whatnot as well. And so it will usually work along something like that. I often can't do creator and editor in the same day because I kind of think I get into a flow and then I burn out. And so like I'll get like 3 hours of solid writing or creation, and then it's sort of like it's over at that point. And so this is the thing, is that I like once you get into a gear, it doesn't really work for me to shift that much. So I try to do them on separate days. And then yeah, I think that's really it, man. I think that's the simplest way I could sort of articulate it, is that it's like different modes of mind, and I'm trying to make space for both of those every single day, and it's built upon the same sort of practice.
Can I just double click on that for a moment into where, so I love this imagery of the child and the editor. That's a beautiful duality. But I'm wondering how you make the child feel safe in that container, in the world. I think that so for some people who do struggle to be creative or tap into it, and I do think, as in like, I think it's a lifeblood in and of itself. I've used your flash in trying to give it to other people, because it has been such a kind of like, once you get that spark, you're like, what is the most vital thing available to me right now? And sometimes that is creativity. And it's beautiful. I'm just wondering how you navigate the two spaces where, does that make sense? Where I say, how do you make the child feel welcome?
I kind of get what you're saying. I think of it maybe a little bit more passionately. It's like the muse, where like maybe the model of the image of the child might maybe get in the way of this a little bit. Like that's definitely a part of it. But as a child, I guess I must be extroverted in my creativity. Some people might be more introverted, but I don't ever struggle with this idea of like I'm maybe shy or something like that. That's maybe when it comes to publishing, that might be a bit more of an issue. But actually, like getting the stuff out on paper has never really been a problem for me. And that might be just the idea that it's like writing in your private journal or something like this. I just don't worry about public eyes being on what I'm putting down as the first draft. I never have that much anxiety about that type of stuff. Instead, I have this sort of it's almost like I'm reporting, like I'm showing up for the muse or God or the creative divine spark or the child. And I'm like showing up and I'm like, yes, sir. And it just starts to blast these images. And I'm like, I will grab them, sir. And I'm like grabbing. And I'm just trying to funnel them onto the page. And I'm trying to grab them before they go. And there's this almost like fear that I'll lose the images if I don't get them quick enough. And so and I don't feel anything in terms of like the child, the creative spirit needs safety to come out. Now that, again, that might be down to my personality. Some people might have a more introverted way that it presents itself. Let's think of it this way: my muse might be some obnoxious bitch, and then other people might have like a sort of like shy, maybe more timid, demure girl, and both of them can have incredible value. So it's important to just understand the way it works with you. But usually my experience is like a torrent, a cascade of visions. And then I have to try grab some, and I usually lose 80% of them. And then I have to try and make do with that.
That is beautiful. Honestly, I was trying to kind of baby step my way towards something godlike or something towards like true reality, because I have truly found that in my practices when I do these workshops on virtues, that those virtues for me are these kind of like fragments of God, and they are the thing that I can kind of stand upon. So I find that fascinating that there's just such a resonance or such kind of through line in what is drawing you forward in into like the material world through time, through space, but regardless, so I'm going to then pivot back over to the other side, and I'm going to ask not necessarily about the editor, but I'm going to ask about tradition. So in this creative space, when we are being creative and it's coming from us, we can be hubristic, we can be Icarus, like flying too close to the sun, thinking that we are God and that we are these kind of bigger than life things, that that what comes out of us is truly true and it doesn't matter about anyone else or anything else. And there's maybe that's a bit overstating it, but there's a fear there. So some sort of relationship with tradition, I find, kind of facilitates that, but it also sharpens creativity in the fact that that the confinements can kind of force the creative function of it, basically. So I'm curious, what relationship do you have with tradition? Do you place that counterbalance?
It kind of depends on what you mean, because there's a lot of different ways that something you might call traditional can show up. Like, for example, with music, I'd have there'd be a pedagogical way that you'll be trained to sing opera. And if you want to write your own opera, you going through the standardized tradition is going to craft your mental understanding of opera very unconsciously. And so when you go to create, many of the patterns you'll use to express yourself will be built into you by the tradition. It's the same way as that if I want to express myself using language, I'm actually in some sense inheriting a tradition of the English language that it's my job to rearrange in a unique way. But I'll never be able to escape the fact that the language as it was presented to me has traditional forms, idioms, terms of phrases that are all installed inside of it. And so you're fundamentally, as a creator, never defeating tradition. Like, that's just the most absurd thing ever. You're in some sense standing on the shoulder of giants is the perfect way that the likes of Newton said it and whatnot. And that's what I noticed with that stuff. It's like actually the better trained you are, often the more elegant your creativity can be. It sometimes can get in the way, but if you are really, really well trained and have that sort of creative genius inside of yourself, it's a great asset. It really, really helps you. It's like, imagine if I'm a creative person and I want to express an idea, but I don't have the language capacity to do it. compared to the guy who's been taught, educated long and hard how to articulate his ideas and present them in very clean language and use imagistic language and understand how to separate them out. That character is going to have a huge advantage for articulating himself because of the tradition that built up that foundation inside of him. Now, that's of course assuming the tradition does that. Some of them might not do that, and that might be an issue. So generally speaking, I'm a pro tradition, I guess you could say, in so far as it helps you to do these jobs correctly.
Beautiful. I do know that you've gone through, that you've both discarded with tradition, and then you went all the way back to like old school Greek tradition.
Oh yeah.
And I would love to know, so what I'm referring to here is the fact that you pulled out of college because you saw it as just something that didn't align with you. But then where you retreated to was this Greek education of being able to speak, read, write, and be physically have a physical presence. And I'd love to know when in that tradition space, what made you register that this tradition doesn't line up with me, doesn't fit me, those constraints don't feed my creativity, and then what made you find the other one where that spoke to you, with those constraints were just like, yes, I feel vitality from that?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I like, if you're talking about the way that the university system is organized right now, my experience again was like really unideological. I went in, now I actually understand it much more ideological, as like they're trying to brainwash people in a very negative way, and I think that you see that's what's going on. But when I was in college itself, I had a very natural young man feeling. I wanted to be greater. I knew I had potential. I wanted to fulfill that potential. I wanted to achieve things in my life. I felt the will to power inside of me. And I knew that I was not living up to that. And I felt shame, and I felt not good enough, and I felt upset, and I felt sort of angsty. I desired to achieve that. And I would go into college, and they would sit me down, and they would, never mind what they would teach me, but they would sit down and they would teach me in a style where I had to sit in the classroom and I had to receive this professor pontificating abstractions and jargon at me that were very dense and very sort of like dragging me up into this realm of conceptualizations. And I thought I was stupid for a while. And then after a while, I kind of just started to get the sus that this is, first of all, not as smart as they're making it out to be, which later I turned out I actually realized was the case. And second of all, it's disempowering. It's getting me stuck in my head. It's getting me taken out of the creative imagination and the visionary part of my mind, and getting me lost in this miasma of like concepts and left hemispheric language, you might call it, or something like this. And so I decided I this is not going to help me. This is not changing me. I looked at what I was changing into over like the time I was in there, and I was like, I'm turning into a fucking dork. This is not what I want to see happen. So I said to myself, right, what would I need to do in order to achieve my goal, to transform into a hero, to become a better version of myself? What would I need to do? And it's like, the gym. I was in the gym and I was lifting weights, and it's like the gym makes no excuses. You get bigger if you lift, if you put in the effort and the intensity and do the procedures. And I realized in college I was doing no procedures. I was going in and it was like I was going in and I wanted to get strong. So what I did is I went into a lecture hall and listened to a guy talk about getting strong. And it's like, that's never going to get you strong. That's not how that works at all. That's so stupid. So instead I said to myself, well, what would be the procedures I need to do to transform me? And I said, well, I want to sing. I want to be able to write. I want to be able to speak. I want to be able to write poetry. I want to know how to public speak. I want to know how to construct speeches. I wanted to know all this stuff. And so I went and I found people who could teach me this. And that's what I went after. I went after these procedures and I went out searching for this. And so insofar, like, again, I'm not necessarily sure you could categorize this as tradition in the way that an awful lot of people understand it, but I understood it back then as the system, if you want to say, the modernist system that's constructed since about the end of the 19th century for educating people. I sort of felt that was not allowing me to fulfill my potential. So I was happy to break free from that and go sort of create my own self-education plan, if you so wish. Now, part of that was me. I wanted to do reading. I wanted to make my mind informed as well as like talented. But I said, I don't need to go to a college and pay whatever I need to pay for each semester to do this. So instead, what I decided to do was, all right, I'm going to go and just take the books out of Greek philosophy and read them. I'm going to read Nietzsche. I'm going to read these types of characters. And so I did this sort of autodidactic learning. And that was a kind of part of it. And so in that way, I grounded myself in the Western canon and our tradition. So I knew what I was doing there. But again, an awful lot of that stuff is not that conscious, and it didn't become apparent to me how big of a deal that was until like basically later in life when Jordan Peterson and all that showed up and kind of revealed to me that there's like crazy shit going on in the world. So that'd be maybe the way I tell that.
That's beautiful. I'd love to kind of just ask, what exactly, you said it wasn't conscious. You didn't find the blueprint for Greek education and kind of follow that. There was no prescription for you. It was you following this kind of gut instinct sort of thing. What was it that led you to it? But then what was it that let you know you were there, that you were in the right space?
Okay, so there's a couple of different things. Like it was a cascade of moments and decisions. I can remember like quite a few of them. So one of them being that I was sitting in so I go into college day after day and I get bored. It's the simplest one, you know. I go into these lectures and I'm just like, this is shit, man. This is not fun. This is not interesting. This is not stimulating. So there's that part of it. I had an understanding from high school of creative writing. I had a teacher who was actually very good at teaching, and he taught me how to write, and he taught me creative writing, which is much different than like writing essays. He taught me fiction. And I realized when I was in college, I had none of that stuff. I found a small creative writing class and I did that, and that was okay, you know, and I learned a couple of things about that. But again, it wasn't like I would have rather been entirely focused on that, but it wasn't there. So I saw this as well. I was like, I don't have any practices. I'm trying to find these practices, but these creative writing practices aren't that fun. They're I'm going in and they were teaching me like minimalist style writing and stuff like this. Like the guy who wrote Fight Club actually is some guy that we studied a little bit in there, which is actually quite good. But again, it's you know, I wasn't learning the Flash or stuff like this. I wasn't learning actual formal, real high quality writing and storytelling. So there's that. And then I would be sitting in classes and I would notice things that are a little bit off. You know, I'd be sitting there and I was in a Judith Butler class and they were describing this is like feminist theory and stuff like this. But as a young man, like I'm a young man, and I'm basically sitting in a class and they're saying, oh, males are the cause of all problems in the world and all this stuff. And I'm like jaded at this point, don't really find this stuff interesting. And now I'm sitting here and having these people basically say that like I should hate myself and stuff like this. And I'm kind of thinking, I don't know, is this for me? Like it doesn't feel like it's empowering me. You know, I didn't feel like someone came in and said, Stef, you're not good enough as you are, which I would have been totally fine hearing. But here's a plan to transform you. Instead, it was starting to get into this point where it's like, Stef, you're not good enough, you're evil, you're bad, tough luck, that type of thing. And so I started to feel that energy and I was like, I didn't like this. I started to just think for myself as I would go home and stuff like this. And I'd look at people I liked. I was like, they have skills that I'm not learning. I'm not actively learning any of these skills that I want. I'd look up where I could learn skills, and I realized it was outside college and things like this. As well, there's other things like I remember I took LSD. And for example, when I took LSD, I had this explosion of my visual imagination, and I had a bad trip as well. But this crazy visual field opened up, this cloud, this flash kind of returned. And I realized that I had that when I was younger, very naturally. I had this very visual dreaming mind when I was a kid. And I kind of lost that over the years. And an awful lot of what I was doing in college was, and maybe late high school, had sterilized that part of me. I like that faculty, that imaginative faculty I did not have. And I remember sitting there once I saw it was like, you know, being given superpowers once and then having them taken away. And then you're sitting there and you're like, holy shit, what was that? Like I had the capacity to be Superman. I just flew around the world. It's like, surely I could fly again. It's like, I've got it in me. I just did it. And so I realized that it was there. And that's when I started to say, well, college isn't helping me. College is turning me into more of this like a book coping jargonite. It's not turning on this part of my imagination. How do I turn that stuff on? I began to search, and this is actually where I got into Carl Jung and things like dream reading and stuff like this. How do I naturally turn on that visual imagination that appeared to me via the false stimulus of a psychedelic? And various explorations like this led to a cascade of things. Not fulfilling my potential, jaded with the curriculum, feeling like I'm getting transformed into a jargonite, glimpses of what is possible, practices that I'm already doing that I knew I could be taken to another level, possibilities of like other places I could go to train, all of that just like cascaded together to me sort of saying, what the fuck am I doing here, man? Like, I'm done.
Got you. Okay, that makes me think of the definition of addiction, where they say that what you're able to do in a certain space becomes narrower and narrower until you've no other option than to do the whatever the cope is or whatever the behavior is, and that the opposite of that is love, and that is when the possibilities come to you. You get the insights of, oh, that's available, of like this kind of expansion sort of thing, which I think is a beautiful definition. And I love that. If I could ask, actually, just following that, when you started doing, so once you got out of the college, the practices that you did start doing, when you started doing the speaking, the writing, these sort of things, did you notice that they weren't as narrow, that they were more generalizable across domains, into your relationships, into your friendships, into your work, into your hobbies, that it just kind of expanded across domains?
Yeah, yes and no. Let's actually talk about a couple of them, because I'm sure you'll find this interesting. Like probably some of them earliest ones I got were like the first one I did was reading the Western canon in some sense. Like I was, as I was leaving college, I didn't do it all at once. As I prepared to leave college, I stopped going to the classes and just started to go to the library. Like towards the last couple of months while I was there, I didn't attend any lectures. I just went and I read Plato's Republic and all these type of things. And so there alone, and I was just going to the creative writing class and just reading the Western canon. And this kind of connected me with the Western tradition. And a lot of things kind of became derivative of this. So, for example, I'm reading Nietzsche, I'm reading Jung, and inside Nietzsche and Jung are little procedures. Now, they're very heavy on theory, but in there are procedures. Nietzsche talks about the necessity to be able to observe. And so, for example, I start to read about that, and I'm like, well, Nietzsche's saying if you want to develop a good mind, you need to learn to observe, to think, and then to articulate. And so I kind of thought about that. It's a very simple statement he makes, but I really thought about what he was trying to say. And I slowly began to realize it's like, oh, that's actually quite similar to like Buddhism and stuff like this. So I'd experiment with meditation. I'd go find meditation classes and stuff like this. I'd practice with those. Always found those very powerful. Always found those very enjoyable. And they really like allowed me to turn off the monkey mind, if you will. I'm reading through Jung. Jung starts to talk about dream reading and stuff like this. And I'm like, wow, that's fucking crazy. What's this all about? And so I start to do that. I start to wake up in the morning and just scribble down stream of consciousness with what's ever in my mind. And over the course of like a couple of years or a year, I have about 250 dreams, and I start to do what Jung says. I start to cross-analyze them and try to find archetypes. And I notice that it starts to switch on this imagination again. This creative, it's very hard to describe, but it's almost like there's a part of my brain that started to switch on that had color compared to a grayscale version of my brain beforehand. And the psychedelics did that temporarily. For about 3 months after my psychedelic trip, I had this like vibrant, like explosively creative imagination, and then that dipped away. And then when I did the dream reading thing, it basically switched it on permanently ever since. And then that was a general thing, because that imagination, this is also another point of the flash that I talk about, that imagination that you develop, that ability to see in color, and have an imagistic form of thinking, becomes relevant to everything. I've done it with sales. I've done it with poetry writing. I've done it with talking to girls. If you're sitting down there and you're trying to tell a fucking story to a girl, you're trying to paint a picture in her head and it's funny and she likes that. You're talking to a friend. You're talking about stories on YouTube. It's all relevant. If you're like, this is a faculty of the human imagination that becomes applicable in every single field of endeavor that you're going to be using: language, narrative, storytelling, communication. It helps you to visualize with like martial arts and stuff like this. I've used it for everything. You've heard about Conor McGregor and visualization. And so developing that visual capacity through dreams, that was one way I started to develop it, and it started to open that capacity up for me. Then I started to go to acting classes, and I started to go to writing schools. I went to a poet. I went to a movie writing workshop. I remember went to some type of like writing course or something like this. I did a little bit of acting, and in all of these, new procedures started to pop up. So the object, the flash, I remember I picked it up in like a writing class when I think it was maybe a musician or a writing class guy was talking about the necessity of using sense-based language. And so that's where I started to get into that. And then I realized doing the flash that's actually switching on the same part as the dream thing was, but maybe from a slightly different angle. And so now I have two things supporting the same faculty, and I'm learning how to actually take that imagistic thing and apply it to formal fiction writing. I start to work on my fiction writing. I start to work on then poetry and lyrics. I start to work on adding imagery into speeches, and all of these powers I start to develop, and they become quite interesting. I go and I practice memory. I remember I got into that for a while, like the memory palaces where you visualize memory. Jesus, man, I had so much stuff now that I think about it. I went to fighting. I went boxing, and I used to go boxing and martial arts, and Conor McGregor was a big deal at this time. And so I was using the flash imagery, the visualization to sit down and imagine myself, fucking battering lads and stuff like this. And I was using this capacity, this tool, in a general sense, in various different areas. And then there's other things that came. I remember I was learning to sing, I was learning to speak, and that was like training the voice, training the capacity to articulate, like drop your voice, articulate yourself quite well. I was training vocabulary. I was working on making music. I was learning music theory. There was loads of other things that were going on there as well, working on improvisation, learning about my creative process, which is something sort of personal. And all of these procedures I was kind of picking up and putting them together to develop, Stef in his like general batch, if you so will. And I worked on a lot of that stuff, and it was very inefficient because as somebody deciding for myself, I wasn't very good at understanding what I needed. It's always better to have a coach to guide you, but I couldn't find no coach that was going to, coach you in the general pursuit of boyo-ness. Like you're never going to find a coach for that stuff. But I did my very, very best by getting people to stand in and kind of help me. And so I set up this sort of like random array of assets that informed me and developed my capacity to do a lot of different things. And they really started to serve me. Like for a while, I was kind of struggling with cash. I started to get an English teaching job that was helping me and stuff like this. I was finding it hard to make some of this stuff practical. It was like I was a boxer learning how to box, but I didn't figure out how to monetize that yet. And then over time, eventually I started to people started to come into my English class and be like, this dude is like so engaging to listen to. The people loved coming to my English classes because I was such a good storyteller. I was such a good teacher. I was very good at breaking down language and putting images in people's heads that helped them memorize. I understood these types of things. Again, the flash coming in handy. And then after a while, people started to notice that. I started to get higher paid jobs. YouTube started to kick off. I started to get like remote English teaching jobs. And then eventually like everything starts to blow up. I start to get a full business online and all these types of things. And so what I'm basically saying is that these capacities served me well over time, but they were a little bit disorganized as I went into them.
I think you're underselling it. I'm not going to lie. As in, I'm not, okay, so I know you're on about here that it activates a different part of your brain, but for me, that has been the crux of my path the last like 3-4 years, has been that once you stop thinking in words and you start thinking in images, then you don't have to logic your way to the next thought, and your brain just is supercharged. It just makes you more dynamic in every bloody setting. It is remarkable. And yes, then you can apply it, and then yes, you've picked up the procedures. But I think you are underselling that, my friend. So just want for the audience there to say that much.
Well, I could definitely get into that a little bit more. I don't know, do you want to spend the time on this? But like the flash, I keep saying this idea, but I think it's more important to understand it as the visual imagination, and that's just a sort of abstract piece of jargon for people. But when you actually get into it, as Nathan's saying here, like the visual imagination, you realize is almost like the superior form of thinking that no one actually trains. The education system does not seem like it's designed to develop the capacity for you to use your visual imagination. Now, a lot of people don't understand why this is important, but you go in and you become a word cell in a theory cell, a jargonite, I call them, in the modern education system. You go in and they stuff words and conceptions and information inside of your head. And then you regurgitate that stuff out like you're a ChatGPT or something like this. But you don't understand that there's another form of thinking that is completely beyond words, that's visual. And it's actually so much more powerful in a variety of different ways. First of all, there's neuroscience behind this. The right hemisphere is something that does not have a language capacity, but can use visuals much better. And it is demonstrated in many ways to be incredibly important for us to be able to contextualize our ideas, to be able to think creatively and laterally and whatnot. And so at the very least, unifying these two hemispheres, unifying your words in your right hemisphere are important. But more so than this, you start to see in so many of the highest arts and highest works in the world, the importance of visualization and visual context and things like this. As I said, like Conor McGregor with his visualization skills in order to become a good boxer. There's actually a lot of studies to show like athletes who use visualizations learn skills better than people who just practice them by themselves. That's absolutely insane. That like I go down and I play basketball, and then the guy who plays basketball and visualizes as well gets better than me. He gets this advantage from using this part of his imagination. And then of course, when you become skilled at any skill like public speaking or sales or online speaking or whatever it is, you'll immediately notice that if you start adding good visual analogies into your articulations, into your speech, people get hooked. People start to say, wow, you're so engaging to listen to, you're such a good storyteller. And all of a sudden you'll start to get more attention, and maybe you won't even know why, but it's because of this asset is that you're doing it. You'll start to come across as funnier because, oh yeah, go on. Sorry, man.
No, I want to, you have it, but I just want to bring in, I do believe there's like a spiritual element to this. I think you are tapping into something that's beyond words, as in the words are the things we can control and manage and everything else. But once you step into that, once you acknowledge even that there is a space beyond words, that we cannot manage everything, you are instantly into this semi-spiritual or tapping into higher patterns or tapping into something that's beyond yourself. And I think for where the West is at the moment, I think that is a really big key. As in, I think that like to unlock that, yes, makes you more capable, makes you more of a force in the world, but it also connects you with something that draws you forward. And I think I don't, for me, this is quite a conscious, like it's I've intellectualized this ironically, but as in for when I speak to you and when I listen to you, you just have this connection to creativity and being drawn forward. And it's just, you identify with it. Like that is you sort of thing. The life force, the living force is the thing that gets drawn forward. I'd love to know, just before I kind of click over to just 3 questions here I finish off with, how do you stop burning out? How do you recognize it?
I burn out from time to time. Yeah, I'm quite good at like it's just being a lazy bastard, man. Like if I feel like I'm getting tired, I'm just gonna sort of say, oh, to hell with this, you know what? Because this is the thing, is that if you're prolific, if you're consistent, there's way less pressure to be obsessive, you know. Like I see this with an awful lot of productivity people, where they want to be productive. You know, their eyes are wired. There's like bloodshot eyes. They're like coming up and they're saying, I've got to be productive again today. I've got to get my 12 hours in today, man. Give me more stimulants, man. And it's sort of like, I probably smash out 6 days a week, 4 hours of high quality work. That's fine. Like I don't need much more. I'd like, if I get a week where I actually like double that, that's fantastic. But I'm not going to force it, because in the kind of ebb and flow of life, me getting that consistently leads to just this cascade effect, as opposed to me having this like brilliant 2 weeks and then just being shit and depressed and like wired on drugs and not being able to do anything and distracted for all the rest of the time. So I try to just kind of even it out in this type of way. But of course I do burn out sometimes. The main reason I burn out is more health reasons. If I get sick, if I overtrain, if I something that goes wrong with my health, I eat something foolish. Like it's very common that I'll go and I'll maybe have like I'll be out with friends and we'll have a bit of food or something like that, and I'll get something that like might irk my stomach or something like this, something just like some crappy food that I shouldn't have eaten. And like this is the sort of modern world that we're in now, and I might be then a bit sluggish for the day, and then I'll have an unproductive day, and that's annoying. And usually what I'll have to do is just admit that that's going to be bad. That can then the next day double busy. I'll be a bit kind of flat out the next day, then that might carry over to the day after that, and then day 3 I might be a little bit kind of fatigued, but that will be my punishment for being undisciplined, if you want to put it this way. But just briefly on your point before about the spirituality of the imagination, if you will, that's a very Jungian perspective, you know, and I think that's like fundamentally correct, that we have this creative imagination, and it's divine. In the actual experience of creativity is, there's this thing that starts to just shuttle out of me, you know, the angel on my shoulder, the muse. And in some sense, I'm observing it as much as anybody else. I stand out of the way and I just let it come out, let these images flash in my mind. And I'm sort of like the guy who's sitting here in front of you and saying, look at all these images flying in my mind. It's not like I'm creating the images per se. I can take respect for it, but really it's coming through me. It's life operating through me. And one day it will stop, and one day I will stop, and that'll be the end of that. And I think there's a deep spirituality in that, one that's very unpretentious as well. Like it's sort of just you connecting with a life force inside of you that literally can't be destroyed until someone shoots you in the head or something like this. And so you have like, people are like, oh, what's God and all this type of stuff. It's like, bro, I sit down there and stare at the screen, and he just starts to fucking blast out through me and fill me full of images and all this type of stuff. It's just like, what more do I need? Like it feels weird to me otherwise. So absolutely.
I saw a great clip of Jack White from White Stripes, and he said that he doesn't identify with the music. He will listen to his own music and just being like, that was someone playing through me. Yeah. Yes, I forged myself to do it and all the rest, but that was like, doesn't identify that is mine. Yeah. Which just struck me like a ton of bricks. Like,
and do you know what's weird is that I've had that experience. I've made music as well. And God, I wish I took the time to do it as high quality as Jack White, because his stuff is brilliant. And I have the exact same experience. Now, there's also a different caveat to this. Again, very, very Jungian idea. But I don't identify as the music, as the creator, like sort of, I channeled it, I guess you could say. But there is a separate identity. But at the same time, when I listen to the music, I realize that that's like my soul. I don't know how to describe that, but the music sounds more like me than I do. I'm sort of the Stef that explains myself to you. But if you want to sort of understand my kind of internalized felt experience or something like that, like what I am, maybe in a deeper level, the music is much closer to that. There's much closer. And maybe it's kind of hard to describe, because maybe it's a different version of me or something like this. But there's definitely like a soul in there, or a taint of that's a part of it. And I just find that quite fascinating, because I've spoken to many artists and they'd say the same thing. They'd stare at their music, and it's like they're looking at the mirror at something that's better than themselves, and it's still them. And it's like, it's not, they don't feel shame. They're like, it's almost like awe, and there's something majestic about it. And it's just kind of hard to describe,
On the topic of music, I have to ask, does Eve still whisper? Is that still an archetype that is stuck in your head?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. I like that buzz. Yeah.
Because I actually really like that song. I thought that was brilliant. And I was like, like Young was speaking there, like there's some like anima sort of like whisperings on going on there. I liked it. So if anyone does want to check out Stefan's music there, it is up on SoundCloud.
I must re-record that as an acoustic version or something like that. I think I could do an even nicer job that way. So I'll get that sorted out.
So as we're coming up to the end, I have 3 questions that I ask everyone to just kind of stretch them in a different way. The first one is, who would make your council of sages? In my quest to try and figure out what the symbols are and what people are listening to and what it is that's connecting us to the bigger thing, that's giving us the insights, importantly. What is it that you look through? So this can be a person or a symbol itself. But what would make your council of sages, that when you see it, when you speak to them, when you think of them, that you just get that's a good bit of advice, or that's a different perspective, or whatever way you categorize it there.
Could you phrase that question again, so just so I can think about it properly?
Your council of sages. So it would be someone who, like for me, it's David Goggins. As in, like when I'm at the gym and I just need to just push and not kind of wimp out and not kind of give myself the forgiveness, Dave Goggins is there just in my ear. Or Jocko Willink, good. That video, like I love that bit. But then on the more kind of like historic side, the yin yang symbol is eternal for me. The crucifix is actually a really big one for me. I know like ABC, anything but Christian, but like, that like horizontal bar where it is past, present, and future vertical, meeting with the horizontal of the world around us. Like that speaks to me in multiple different situations, in like for multiple different ruts that I get stuck in. So does that kind of facilitate an answer there?
Jung always said that Christ is the symbol of the self for the Western European man, for European man. So I think it is quite important to stay true to those symbols. I'd actually go to Christian churches as well from time to time. I attend them. I actually probably attend them more than like most people who'd consider themselves somewhat religious. It's quite funny, but I would do that. And I do find great solace in the imagery of Christianity. I think it's very, very powerful. I'd obviously love to have Nietzsche to chat with him and see what he thought about things and see his
Oh,
perspective
yes.
and these type of things. I'd always like characters who, like are sort of pragmatists. They're sort of in the world. I could sit down and talk to them, like writers and poets. James Joyce would have been lovely to speak to, and William Butler Yeats, these type of characters. I think they'd be awesome to kind of get their perspective on things. They're like writers, they're articulators, this type of stuff. And I'd look to European heritage. I spend an awful lot of time looking at history. History is just one of the greatest mentors of all. So I love like looking at, Caesar, looking at Irish history, looking at the pagan religions and their perspectives and these type of things, the kind of mythos that we have around ourselves. So in some sense, yeah, like I'd appeal to the broad gods, like as Alexander the Great said, when you were among the gods, you always feel alone, but you're getting the wisdom, you're receiving something off them. So I always look to that type of stuff as an educational thing. Nietzsche would then obviously be included in that as like one of the sages, I guess. And then people who have skills. I love speaking to people who have a comprehension of skill development. I find those are very, very useful people, and they have a very grounded way of thinking.
Beautiful. I was just thinking through there actually, because I did get lost in the kind of bigger imagery there, and I was like, if I was being really honest, there's one fictional character out of a book called Red Rising, and I'm waiting. Actually, the next book is out, like I think next year or something like that. But it's just one of those like hero story sort of things. But he just has my imagination where he's there. He has a place for overcoming and just not giving in.
Let's go.
So question number 2 then is, in trying to aspire, in trying to be better than we are, and in trying to improve, we can get very serious in being productive, in trying to achieve in like success or all the material things or whatever it is. We can get very serious. And I do get from you that you definitely have a sense of play in your creativity and all the rest. Like maybe this question is just a wash for, it's just a tee up for an easy answer for yourself. But maybe if I could kind of just dig in a little bit on, is there anything, as you kind of like reorder life and adjust and stuff like that, is there any one place in particular at the moment where you're trying to that it went a little sterile, it went a little kind of formatted or mathematical?
Yeah, like Nietzsche has the famous quote where the maturity of a man is reached when he develops the seriousness of a child at play. And I think that captures it perfectly, because there's all sorts of brilliant paradoxes with this. There's another writer, I can't remember his name, but he was asked like, oh, how do you make sure that you get the muse to come every single day? And it's like, well, me and her have an arrangement that we meet every single day at 9 a.m. at my desk. And so he just shows up every day and he gives her space, and then she kind of shows up and the playful creator shows up. And I think there's definitely some type of, if you have this like foundation in place, some type of routine, some type of stability, it can be very, very fertile for joy and for creativity and for play and these type of things. But at the same time, you can sometimes kind of get stuck in ruts and whatnot. And usually what I find with that is, if I'm getting lost in a little bit of a rut, I'll try to, like in my experience in life, I try to just shift up it's almost like the format or the style or the genre. So if I'm there and I'm making a YouTube video and I find myself turning into a little bit of like a jargonite myself, I might say to myself, right, next YouTube video, I have to tell a story. I'm not allowed to explain. I have to try to tell a story. Or I'll make a Twitter thread and I'll have to try to tell a story. Recently, I did the story on the Christianity as the woke movement of Rome. And that was me actually trying to do that, because I was like, I'll try to actually tell this story instead of explain it. And it's like, just fucking went nuclear, and all the just torrents of people being like, hey, blah, 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 this type of stuff. So I have this understanding of, if I need to shift something up, I try to force myself more into the visual imagination, and the task becomes so monumental and difficult that it usually covers up all needs to kind of break things up. And if worse comes to worse, I just kind of take a break from things for a while. Like, I'm not afraid of doing that stuff at all. If I find myself getting burnt out, if I find I'm getting a little bit jaded, I'll go hit the beach for a couple of days. I'll just go like be lazy. I'll not put any pressure. I won't have to, like, I'll just kind of figure out a way to plug out and hang out in nature or something like this, or go play sports or whatever it is. And usually when you come back, you're revivified, if you so will.
Beautiful.
And
Okay.
there's one last caveat to that as well, is there's a sort of severity to it. Like if I find that like when I'm telling really hard truths, I'm being really clear, um the energy is just so much more intense and it's scary. I like usually even the Christianity in Rome one is a little bit intimidating to talk about because a lot of people like feel very strongly about Christianity, and I'm not exactly someone who wants to go around acting like Richard Dawkins bashing them. And so I knew that that was going to have an emotional response. I didn't know it would be quite so extreme, but nonetheless I knew it was there. And because I could feel that kind of like the rising of those tingles, I was like, oh, here we go. This is gonna get energy anyway. I started to realize it's like, all right, there's something here. Like that's definitely not too serious. It's definitely not too kind of jaded, this type of stuff. But it's a good schema though to always challenge yourself and say like, how can I add a bit more humor, a bit more style into what I'm doing here? How can I look at this differently?
So do you recognize the child come out when there's that just extra bit of tongue in cheek, when it's just kind of like, oh, we're going to get in trouble here?
Sometimes there's a couple. I guess there's a couple of different ways it shows up. It's like sometimes I'll maybe write something, and it will be a little bit me explaining and flat, and I'll be trying to like get a point across, and that point might be certainly, might annoy people, but I'm still trying to explain, and then I'll catch myself doing that, and I'll say to myself, and then I'll pull back and I'll try to approach it with a different energy, a different tone, a much more like dancing, exciting, dynamic tone. And that will change the way that I frame the narrative. And usually that comes across an awful lot more boisterous, an awful lot more funny, and an awful lot more exciting. And that usually massively helps the voice of the narrative, and reframes entirely what I was doing, but still gets the point across. And sometimes it can actually win people over an awful lot more than I thought beforehand, instead of piss them off.
Oh, Steph, you're killing me with that one, because we're at the end. I have one more question I can ask you, but I actually meant at the start of this, I was meant to ask you how you balance between being more assertive and how you being more reactive to the environment and people around you, because I know you're a social guy and all the rest. I'm raging that I didn't get around to that one, but I won't kind of encroach on any more of your time, and I'll ask you the final question, and that is, what advice would you give to the West, perhaps for yourself in particular, in this like super analytical, like we're all trying to figure our way out, we're all trying to know our next logical step, we're all testing our feet to make sure that we're going to be safe and all the rest, and no one's daring to be vital and to just strive forward and all the rest. If you're in that space, what is your advice to that mindset, for that mindset?
Yeah, like Western people, we have our own story and culture, and it's a majestic one, like Paradise Lost, Goethe's Faust, the Bible, the story of all of Western Christian history, Nietzsche, Jungian psychology. Like we've got so much vivid narratives and a dream world inside of our heads. And we kind of live in an era now where people, for a variety of different reasons, have developed this very like Nietzschean slave morality resentment towards Western culture. And there's this animus inside people that they want to like strangle that and castrate that and stop us from making our culture and putting forward our images and putting forward our dreams. Now, there's two sides to this. One of it is that there's people who like feel they're outside of the West or reactive to the West, and they have this attitude towards it. So they're sort of like, trying to put it down and say that it's evil and all these type of things and shackle it with guilt. And that's not good. But I think maybe even a bigger problem, or a bigger part of the problem, is there's a lot of Western people who develop this sort of like, as Nietzsche would say, this guilty shame, self-hating morality that's anti-life, as he might describe it. More specifically, it's sterile and doesn't produce culture, doesn't produce dreams, just doesn't produce energy. And then wrapped up with this as well is this sort of Western type that's a big problem that we've always had to deal with. Nietzsche, for example, wrote an awful lot about the intellectuals and the struggles he had with them. And this is like the sterile, over-analytical jargonite that I'm always banging on about. And these are very real parts of the West. These are flaws in the Western psyche and Western psychology. And we kind of have to understand how we deal with all of these at once. Like we need to figure out a way that we can make space for the creative young men of the future to start producing culture for ourselves again, and really like mine into our spirits, because fundamentally like Western people are probably one of the most creative people who've ever been on earth, and they have an incredible story to tell, an incredible contribution to the world. Like, these are the people who, you know, invented penicillin and stopped everybody from dying when they're like 4 years old. These are the people who made it to space. Like, it's absolutely crazy to see them destroy themselves like the way they're destroying themselves for precisely Nietzsche's categorizations, this sort of nihilism that's going on. And so in some sense, we have a responsibility as creative young men to hold ourselves up to an incredibly high standard, become as competent, as skilled, as educated, as useful as humanly possible, become as creative as possible, figure out ways that we can develop that creativity ourselves, go and put ourselves into the world and show that we're the most competent, the most well-ordered, rational, clear-headed, creative, explosive people with strong vitality. We are the people who put out our stories. We are the people who are going to put out positive stories with an awful lot of energy. We're going to mine our dreams and bring our dreams out and put them out. And we're going to stop with this bickering and this nonsense where people are like, I want to destroy the West, and I want to hate all their stories and shackle them with guilt, and I want to hate myself, and then I want to get lost in abstractions of academies and jargonizing and all these type of things, and instead get back to something that's vivid and life-giving and authentic. And really, it's just a sort of something that's down on all of us, like all of us young guys in this network that have begin to interact with each other over the internet, to realize that that's the task for us for over the next couple of decades, is to actually achieve that, pull that off in all areas of life. And that will leave an incredibly fertile foundation that will blossom later into a strong culture, once again, that will take the West on an ascendant path.
That is a beautiful call to action, and
let's go.
Thank you so much for this whole interview. It has been an absolute pleasure. Stefan, you're an absolute force in the world. Thank you so much for this and for all the videos. So if anyone wants to check Stefan out, I would suggest check out his music on SoundCloud, check him out on Instagram, check him out on YouTube. That video on Christianity in Rome is brilliant. I would highly recommend it. But with all of that said, Stefan, once again, thank you so much.
Nathan, thank you very much, man. And any boyos watching, give Nathan and I'll follow, and a like, a subscribe, a drop a comment, all those type of things. Give him a little bit of juice. That'll be fantastic. So thank you very much, man.